Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to the Open News meeting in the virtual Tortoise newsroom. It's me, Liz, instead of James. James isn't able to be here this lunchtime, so you've got the B team, I'm afraid. It's a pleasure to see everybody. My colleague Merapi is in the chat, and there she is, and she's in her garden in the chat. And as always, please do weigh in with what you think and your points of view. I want to hear from as many people as we possibly can. Open News is a bit different than normal thinking. It is our editorial commissioning meeting effectively. And we are looking here to explore angles on stories that are sort of breaking a little bit now or are lurking in the periphery that we think might be interesting for us to explore a bit more, to interrogate, and maybe to get an investigation team on. So we really do want to hear what floats your boat, what you've spied, and if you've seen some things that we've missed, then we really do want to hear that too. My colleague Basha Cummings is here to help us go through the news list. If you have your app to hand, we published it this morning at 10 a.m. Pete Hoskins pulled together a particular story or beginnings of a story underneath one of our big 5 editorial themes that we think might be interesting. And we're going to try and dig into a couple of those today. So if Bash is there to kick us off, as always, as I say, join in the chat. There she is. Put your little blue hand up if you'd like to. You can find it by pressing the participants button, and let's crack on. Basha, what's on our mind?
Lots of things on our mind. I've actually pulled out 3 things from that news list because I think they kind of talk to each other in an interesting way, and I think they're a good starting point for this discussion. So I'm sure most of you will have got the news alert on your phone saying that we're reopening, that Boris Johnson has decided that we're going to shift from 2 meters to 1 meter distancing, that we're going to reopen hairdressers, cinemas, galleries, museums. And I was thinking back to that moment a few days ago where there was a queue outside of Primark, I think it was in London, and there was a lot of sniping at this image of this Primark. Some people saying, you know, what are these people doing? They're crazy, they shouldn't be, you know, why are they flocking to a Primark after 3 months of lockdown? And then another group of people saying, well, hang on, not everyone can buy stuff online. You know, when not everyone has that privilege. There's many reasons why a lot of people would genuinely need to flock to a Primark on the first day that they're able to. And I think that particular thing got to the heart of a question that I think is unanswered, which is interesting beyond the economics of the high street, which many of you will know Chris Cook has been sort of tracking for us since the beginning of lockdown. But there's a sort of like, are we culturally ready for a reopening? What does that restoration look like? So many people are on different sides of the fence on this. And if you look at the statistics, I was looking at a bit in this after Pete drew together this news list earlier. England's high streets at the moment, there's a 50% increase in footfall week on week. So we've gone up quite a bit recently, but that was from a very low bar. So we're still at 30% lower in terms of, you know, customers going in and out of shops than we were at this time last year. Added to that, I think that even if we were to restore our kind of full shopping capacity and everyone's happy to go and only be a meter apart from each other and go shopping, the sort of spectre that was haunting the high street anyway, which was online shopping, has only been accelerated by the pandemic. So I think there's a few things to unpick there. And I'd actually be very keen to hear from members who are on this call just how they feel about, you know, are they going to be going shopping this weekend? Are they excited about it? How do you feel about handling money? You know, I think there's all these things that were kind of instilled in us at the beginning of lockdown that we sort of have really taken on that I think are going to be hard to let go of. So I think the question about the high street is a really interesting one. Yeah. Related to that is one of the things that we picked out and we're keen to do more on is the impact of youth unemployment specifically. So there's that sort of horrible irony, which is that young people are the least affected by the virus itself, but will probably be one of the most affected groups in terms of the economic fallout. And for me, I'm very interested in this because I was 19 in 2008. I was in my second year of university. So I basically graduated into the embers of the financial crash and, you know, have lived through what that meant for careers, housing, benefits, austerity. Like my whole age group and those just above and below me will have experienced that. And And it's clear that this is about to happen to the next generation, to the pandemic generation. And there's an interesting group called the Youth Employment Group, who have drawn together some stats around this. And they've said that pre-lockdown, 750,000 young people were not in education, not in employment or in training. And post-lockdown, they're expecting that we will add 600,000 young people to that number. So that's a huge increase. And I think it's clear looking at that if we want to mitigate these long-term scarring effects, we have to get young people back into work, and quite quickly. The furlough scheme is about to end. So I think kicking around some sort of convincing ideas about like, how do we get young people working? How do we get them back into apprenticeships and training schemes is really important.
Yeah.
And the third thing, and then I'll shut up. The third thing is related again. All these three ones are related in one way or another. I was really struck by the Trump's Tulsa rally, which on the surface is, depending on your feelings about Trump, quite funny. He was bigging it up, saying 1 million people were going to come to and setting aside the fact that the very act of holding it in Tulsa, this place where there was this terrible race massacre in 1921, and the provocative nature of that in the middle of Black Lives Matter, set that aside. He said that there were going to be 1 million people there. There were actually only around 6,000 in a stadium that had a capacity of around 40,000. And it turns out, or at least it was claimed afterwards, that this was a sort of part prank, part protest by people on TikTok, which is a video sort of social site, and fans of K-pop, which is Korean pop music. Team Trump say that's not the case, but I think it again raises a really interesting question about Gen Z. So lots of people are saying the kids are all right, Gen Z are great, you know, they're sort of climate change busting, you know, they're going to sort things out for us. There's a really interesting piece in the New York Times which sort of dismantled that a bit, and there was this particularly very good line, which was, just as millennials were clumsily dubbed as the avocado toast loving, industry killing generation, the Gen Z stereotype is an equally reductive portrait, a sardonic, nihilist, climate change conquering group of social media vigilantes righteously trolling for social justice. And I think with that story, and what that made me think about was, we don't yet know the impact on that generation, what it means to spend 1 or 2 years of your young adult life social distancing, what it means to graduate into a depression right in the footsteps of another generation that graduated into a recession. So I think there's these three things are sort of local in terms of high street and spending. It's, you know, more national in terms of youth unemployment. And I think there's something bigger and cultural, which is how do we think and talk about Gen Z, and how do we understand what they're facing? So those are my sort of starter points for everyone.
Thank you very much, Basha. They're excellent, meaty starting points for everybody, and I've already got a ton of people that I want to come to. I'm going to actually start with Basha and my colleague Zav, because he's been doing some work on youth unemployment, and also he's on a deadline, and I made him come, and I promised I'd go to him first. So Zav, are you there? Hiya.
Yeah, hi. Can you hear me?
Talk good, but talk quick.
Yeah, I'll talk quick. Yeah, so we are holding this education summit tomorrow, and then in advance
On Thursday.
On Thursday.
Yeah.
Sorry, Thursday, not on Thursday. And I was commissioned to write this piece about the lost generation of COVID, because the UN back in April kind of sounded warnings that there will be potentially a whole generation of young people who are, you know, alienated from the world of work, alienated in terms of issues and, you know, their values and their issues being represented politically. So off the back of that, I've been talking to a lot of young people. We did a survey in our app asking members to say, you know, are they rethinking their careers? Have they lost their jobs? How are they feeling? And just to kind of run through kind of a few interesting starting points. I think one interesting starting point is that there's this tendency to separate out the educational crisis and an employment crisis, and I think we shouldn't be doing that. I think when we are talking about school closures, and lost attainment, and all of these, things which teenagers are going through, we should be also thinking, what is that going to mean 5 or 10 years down the line? Because as Basha kind of intimated, there are scarring effects potentially, like ways that you might be affected for life. And then in terms of employment itself, one of the big issues is that like 1/3 of 16 to 24-year-olds have been furloughed or have lost their jobs, against 1 in 6, across working age adults. And it seems that part of the reason for that is that they are the age group that are predominantly working in the retail sector and the hospitality sector.
Yeah.
And so, not only was there an immediate shutdown there, but as Basha has kind of said, when they reopen, they will be reopening in some kind of skeletal form. And again, as she says, it's all very well telling people you can go shopping, you can go to the cinema, you can go to the pub. But I think realistically, we will all make choices. We will all be tempered to some extent. So we will all be saying, actually, I won't go to the cinema, I'll go to the pub instead. We won't be living a kind of, I think, a normal, life in that sense. And I suppose that the kind of third element of this is that for lots of the young people who I'm talking to, who are, young graduates, it's putting them in a really difficult position, because the COVID pandemic for them has like solidified lots of things politically about what jobs are valuable, what jobs are good for society, about, people over money. And so on the one hand, they have the pandemic, confirming all their values as to what work they want to go into and the life they want to live through their careers. And on the other hand, they have this kind of helplessness where they feel like there's no jobs around and that they can't afford to take that risk. And the final thing I'll say in this is I talked to someone from Reclaim, which is a Manchester-based charity, which kind of works with teenagers, kind of helping them to become young leaders in working class communities. And two things she said to me really stood out. The first thing was that she said that she has 12 and 13-year-olds who are worried about their careers now in a way that she's never had that before. And she put that down to this, something about the immediacy of this crisis, the fact that we can feel the economic crisis because we are all changing our behavior around. It is kind of the reason for that. And the second thing she said is that she's got a lot of young people who already are changing their career paths to safer careers. So lots of people who were thinking of going into the arts, for instance, who are now seeing that as too great a risk. And I think in industries which are already dominated by the middle class, if you have lots of working class young people who don't feel comfortable taking risks on their careers, you could end up, in class terms, with an even more kind of fragmented kind of workforce across these industries.
Yeah, fascinating. Thanks, Zab. There's a lot in there, isn't there? One of the candidate thinking questions that I had down for one to do in July was, has there ever been a worse time to be young and British? Obviously, it's not just affecting people in this country, it's affecting everybody around the world. But I wondered aloud to myself as I was toying with the idea, and I had a brief chat with Matt about it, whether every generation feels like this or if this is actually different. I mean, the depth of the recession and the scale of the panic, if you like, would seem to be different. And I suppose other recessions arguably haven't had that, as you say, direct impact on the arts and culture. Sort of popular British culture to a large extent has been shaped by tough times and recessions, and you get a kind of youth cultural thing that comes out of that. It almost seems like the opposite will be true this time, which arguably will sort of affect the fabric of the nation culturally in a way that other recessions haven't. Sav is nodding on mute.
Sorry, I was on mute. No. I mean, I completely agree with that, and it obviously has kind of big effects on the mental health of young people, and I think there's increasingly stats coming out about how do young people feel about agency in their life. Like, do they feel like they have agency in their life? And you know, as you'd kind of expect, is predominantly the ones who are not in employment, not in education, not in training, who don't feel like they have agency in their life. And you know, the 2008 recession, at least maybe there was a kind of path out of it. But for us, you know, you might just think, well, in a year's time, if there's a second wave, no one's going to be able to kind of help. The economy shutting down again. So I kind of understand why there's kind of existential kind of questions which young people are going through.
Yeah, it would seem that the thinking about what you Basha read out from the New York Times as well, the sort of characterization of this generation is really fraught. People don't seem to know yet quite where to put them, which is something that will wash through. And I might actually, Polly's got her hand up. There's a ton of people. I'm going to come to John Alexander. I definitely want to unpack this thing in the chat that Chris and Paul Cottrell are talking about to do with section 114. So I'm coming to you, but Polly's got her hand up, and I wonder if this is because Polly edits our next gen thinkings and you want to do a shout out for the youth.
It is slightly, I just thought it's worth saying, we don't know this yet. We don't know that it's going to be this terrible for this generation yet. And I think it's at moments like this when you can write the narrative that makes it true as well. And I guess just so that we don't get too stuck into one track of what this story is going to be, just exploring the idea that there could be some positives out of this. You know, maybe actually generations who have had these huge spanners thrown into their work, into their kind of lives at these times, could develop, you know, more skills around resilience. You know, potentially we talk a lot about kids being over-schooled and over-drilled, and you know, there have been some things in my own children, and obviously I'm in a privileged position of having security and all of those things, but actually being freed from some of the pressures of schools, there are some interesting sides to that as well. So more, you know, it's not that I just wanted to introduce a note of let's just kind of keep challenging ourselves on this idea, because we don't know what the story is yet.
For sure. Thank you, Polly. I'm going to come to Paul Cottrell, if that's okay, who's come from left field with local authority section 114, the local authority cataclysm. Hi, Paul.
Hello, I wasn't expecting that.
Tell us what it is.
Right, well, Section 114 is a little bit hidden in the Local Government Finance Act 1988, and it says...
I've not read it, I have to say.
No, well, I'm a geek, I read this stuff. But I think John Alexander, who's on the line, I think will know more about it than me, because he's clever. But what it means in the end is that you can only... Section 114 puts a duty on the Chief Financial Officer of a local authority to declare when a council is going to spend more than it brings in.
Right.
And at that point, they have to reduce, under law, to statutory services only. So they can't do any of the stuff that they usually do, apart from the really statutory stuff. I won't get into what's statutory, what's not, but it's fairly obvious. And it certainly means that come the second wave, if they're under Section 114 notice, they won't be able to do any of the stuff they've been doing through the first wave of the pandemic. And there's loads of local authorities like this, most of them really. Most of them keeps their cards close to your chest. Leeds is speaking up a bit about it. Others are, I think there's one down south somewhere, Wiltshire, I think, is speaking up about it. But it's coming rapidly, and the government's doing notes about it. So, well, that's it really. That's the briefing.
Okay. Thanks very much, Paul. I'm tempted to go to Chris Cook in his vibrant coloured T-shirt, because somebody says local authority or local government, and I'm afraid I default to you. Thank you for wearing day glow. It helps for me to see you.
Exactly. I'm so hard to find in here usually. I was struck by, I think I've sort of been working on the assumption that it's quite easy to go after one local authority. The politics of Northamptonshire going bust are pretty easy to manage. When it's every local authority, you will be in a different block. And so maybe I'm a little bit more relaxed. Relaxed is the wrong word, But I don't think they've got an option. The government's going to have to start industrially bailing out the local authorities. I think on one of the other things we published today, one of them was on is our latest retail shock tracker. So we've been looking at basically card spending by Britons, and for the first time we've now got data for Scotland. And one of the things that's really clear is that England has been unlocking down basically for about a month now. So we've been England and Wales have recovered about half of the spending losses that they suffered at the beginning of the lockdown. We're already halfway back to normality, and whereas Scotland is largely still down there. And the places that are suffering the most are sort of retail and hospitality places. And I do wonder whether we need to talk more about the geography of some of this, because it may be that London is back to normal fairly fast, but say Cumbria and Cornwall and Oxfordshire, places that are very reliant on long travel trade, are going to remain in a very prolonged recession, which is going to be really tough, obviously, on young people who live in those places.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's actually one of the things that people forget is that the things that have been most hard hit are some of the biggest employment sectors for students. So people who rely on a part-time job while they're doing their studies.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to go to John Alexander, who posted a link to the Grimsey report on high streets, who can maybe pick up from where Chris has left off. John, are you there? Hi, John.
Hello.
The Grimsey thing.
So the Grimsey review, so I think he was, I actually don't, Paul's given me far too much credit. I don't know a huge amount about it. What I do know is that it popped up on my reads the other day. I think Grimsey was the CEO of Wix and has been involved in various kind of reviews of the high street. But this one has been very interesting. It's picked up by Vidya Alekson, who's the CEO of Power to Change, and lots of energy around the core idea really of this Grimsey review is to say that the local communities should own their own high streets and should be able to sort of have massive kind of right to buy opportunities, and that would be a route to sort of setting rents and so forth that would be realistic. There's a huge range of recommendations in there. I haven't actually been able to get my head around it yet, but it seems like pretty provocative stuff and taps straight into what Paul and Chris were talking about, sort of this whole thing of like, what's the role of local authorities, the sort of central versus local narrative that feels like it's really at the heart of the UK's COVID response, to my mind.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had a go at that whole central versus local thing a few ways round. I'm not sure we've landed on a perspective on it yet. Chris might move his head to indicate whether he agrees with me or not. We've sort of looked at, and we've got a few more thinkings coming up. We're going to look at metro mayors and that sort of thing. I wondered, this is an absolutely speculative thing, as I crossed the road in London last week in zone 3 in a sort of quite run-down area of London where the shops were all still closed, but it just made me think, in zone 3 you're far enough away to not be easy to get in on your bike, and it just made me wonder whether the sort of spreading out of some of the prosperity, or the sort of vibe, if you like, of retail and shops and stuff like that just might reverberate outward from the centre a little bit. And then of course I came home to where I am now in rural Oxfordshire, where there isn't a shop. You really can't get to a shop unless you get in a car. And I just thought to myself, well, as Chris Cook says, the geography of this, you know, the devil is very much in the detail. It really is. Even here, I'm right on the edge of Northamptonshire. I'm not actually in Northamptonshire, actually. I'm dangerously close to the edge of Northamptonshire. But even here, I think it's going to be a very nuanced thing to design sort of urban, rural, semi-rural spaces that function as local environments.
Just to come in, a couple of quick thoughts on, just to sew into your local stuff. I think there's a big difference, and this is more of a broader point. I think there's a big difference between thinking about metro mayors and thinking about local. And that's an obvious thing to say, but like to the extent that a piece by a guy called Simon Duffy, who runs a thing called the Centre for Welfare Reform, based out of Sheffield. He's a really interesting guy, well worth you guys looking at. He's quite provocative sometimes. He wrote this piece called Colonisation 3.0, where he talks about his sort of thesis is that Britain has turned its colonising tendencies in on itself. and it actually positions kind of metro mayor structures. I'm not saying I go with this completely, but it's quite interesting to hold up as a provocation, like actually as almost a kind of colonial governor rule to make it easier for the centre to carry on or to replicate its own structures rather than genuinely kind of diffusing and distributing power.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting one to look at. And then, and just to your other thing, and maybe a bit more in my own perspective, because I'm a bit of a poly on this. I kind of try and find the good news. I think there's something very interesting in this moment that I think you're hinting at, which is as commuting becomes something that we do a lot less of, and we're sort of spending more time in the places where we live, there could well be a huge surge, and we're already seeing actually there's far more people I know in sort of LGA and councillor networks are saying there's far more local groups, hyper-local kind of neighbourhood democracy groups forming and doing stuff, much more kind of active citizenship at that very grassroots level. And that might translate into, I mean, what a signal it would send about the future of Britain if there were sort of record numbers of candidates at the local elections next year, for example. And so there's some really interesting stuff. And I do think the local versus central is a huge angle on this that still isn't talked about quite enough.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Nice to see you, John. Always nice to see John on our open news thinking. So there's a couple of people have asked to post another link to the Grimsby Review, which John did earlier in the chat. So if one of my colleagues might be able to unearth it and repost it, that would be fantastic. I did wonder a bit about cash, actually, the last line of before we leave the high street, and shopping. I'd like to know what people feel about shopping. I have mixed feelings. I know we need to wake the economy up, but in the very early part of lockdown, a lot of our thinking, and it wasn't only sort of younger voices, it was right across the mix, people saying, wouldn't it be great if we could rebuild without going economy first, if we sort of were able to rebalance a little bit. But I just noticed myself, I moved house on the very first day of lockdown. I had to pay the removal guy in cash. So I went to the cash machine and I got £500 in cash out of a cash machine. And I didn't need to give it all to him. But here we are 3 and a bit months later, and I've still got that cash just sitting there in my purse because I haven't found anyone who will take it away from me. So it's a sort of odd thing, really, that I used to sort of look with quite a lot of pleasure at, you know, two £20 notes in my purse and think there's some money, but these days I look at it and think, well, this is actually no use to me at all. I do wonder, and I read something yesterday about how there's some concern in the retail sector about the reopening being a sort of acceleration for spreading the virus, for those operations that can't do contactless, and there are obviously plenty of them. And I just wondered, I'd love to know what people feel about the reopening of the shops, and if they're excited about it and are going to head out and, you know, do their bits and bobs and just enjoy themselves a little bit, or if they're more reticent to do that. Is anybody able? Let's go to Hester. Hester's got her hand up. Another regular. Hi, Hester. Nice to see you. Not seen you for a bit.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Sorry, it was popping up on mute a few times. You can hear me, yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi. Hello. Yeah, good to see you again. Yeah, on the shopping front, I wanted to put in. I'm really excited that shops are reopening and people are starting to go shopping again. Obviously for the economic reasons, and secondly because it shows less fear in the society. But I don't think people need to be so I live in central London, just pretty much above Camden Town, and the whole 2 meters apart thing, it's really not been feasible throughout all of lockdown. If you go to, let's say, like Lidl in Kentish Town High Street, or an Aldi in Camden High Street, they've got these 2 meters apart things on the floor, and yet if you observe people how they shop, nobody can remember exactly what's in what aisle. And I speak to my mum who's in Dorset, and they've got these one-way systems going in the big supermarkets, and she really gets told off if she goes round the other way. It's sort of like an IKEA or Tiger approach, I hear.
Yeah.
But from where I'm at, like, none of that's been happening. I do a lot of my shopping in international fruit and veg markets and places like that, and Holloway and things. Those have been open throughout all of lockdown, and you cannot help but come in close proximity with people. That's been happening the whole time. So I when I hear stories like this, the potential fuss made about people outside Primark trying to get back in, I kind of think the horse has already bolted in some senses. It's not been possible to do the social distancing in some parts, certainly in city centres. So I kind of wanted to put in, I'm really excited that people are going shopping again. I think the economy needs it, and I think people probably should try not to be too scared, because there's been many incidences where social distancing just hasn't been, pragmatic or physically possible anyhow throughout all of this. So I think we should probably go for it. I'm sad because I'm furloughed, so I probably won't be going shopping myself, but I want other people to.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks, Hester. I agree. I'm just laughing at Chris's note, taking his life in his hands at Tesco in Purley last week. Frankly, I'd have been safer buying bat steaks in Wuhan. They do bat steaks at Tesco in Purley, I think. So I'm just not sure where they get them from Wuhan.
I can give Chris lots and lots of shops he may want to avoid in the pound stretcher in sort of Camden is not where you want to be.
Pound stretcher in Camden is not where you want to be at any time of day, I would imagine. I'm going to go to Nico. Nico's another regular, who's reminding me, and one of our jobs at Tortoise is to try and join the dots with little crumbs of ideas for stories that come up in thinkings that are far apart. And we did have a really good one on the arts. Can the arts survive the virus? Was it about 6 weeks ago, Nico?
I've got the 6th of May in my diary.
I mean, time is elastic now, so it could have been last year for all I know. But remind us what we were talking about then. Did someone have a good idea?
Well, I'm actually quoting someone else. I'm not sure quite what the ethics of this are, how private our conversations are. But Tony Butler said there's a huge role for cultural organisations to play in the recovery of our regional centres. The COVID crisis will accelerate the decline of retail on the high street. Arts and culture should assert a role in reimagining the place where we meet, trade and play, which I liked, not least because it connects up to ideas we've had already about young people not going into the arts. This has been quite the high street, I know we're sort of moving off that, it's been quite a big discussion with I've forgotten her name now, someone else will know, the former retailer Mary Portas, in her review of the high street. And there's quite a lot of discussion around the role of technology and making in the high street and the role of community spaces and so on. So I think it would be quite an interesting theme to address. Nobody seems to kind of get the whole picture of it, if you like.
It's I think that's because nobody knows. A little bit to what Polly was saying, it's very difficult to know how one thing is going to affect another, is going to affect another, is going to affect another. But yes, for sure. I think there's something interesting in the briefing note, which actually is posted in the news list from that youth employment group. They have a set of really quite detailed recommendations that are oriented to youth employment, but it talks about, see if I can see it on my phone, it talks about sort of the establishment in particular of funded sort of arts and culture, local arts and culture facing apprenticeships and things, to make sure that young people in particular are focused not only just on filling the gap to what Zav was talking about, so you don't have to be privileged and middle class anyway to be able to get a job as in an inverted commas sexy sector, but also that you're focused on your local environment. There's a really long list of recommendations, which I'm clever people than me will realise how that would work in practice and how it would be funded and all the rest of it. But it's all in the same space, isn't it?
There will be a move back to the local as well, or there has been already. I mean, an interesting case study might be Whitechapel, which is where we live. And the Tower Hamlets Council is moving to the old Royal London Hospital, and there's also cultural facilities being created there, and part of the Barts and London Research Centre is going to be there as well, and it's got Crossrail opening when it opens. So as a high street, I think it's quite an interesting example. Actually, I think it will be revivified to some extent with those factors. Maybe the role of local authorities in doing that is a thing to look at as well. Yeah, interesting. Polly is already ready to cast off her reputation as the positive one of the crew, and has just posted this sad Twitter thing. Polly, what's happened? You had your hand up and now you're gone.
Oh, that's because I left my hand up because it's like I've never been to a thinking before and I don't know how to do it. No, it was just a tweet. I noticed that Plymouth Theatre is about to make its entire staff redundant, and it's the first of the big kind of regional shutdowns for the arts. So it was just something that talked to that conversation.
I find it, yeah, I mean, I think the personal stresses in the arts are really extreme. A good friend of mine works for a very prestigious big London theatre and is making his entire team redundant as we speak. And I think that that kind of pressure, I mean, the pressure on him is immense, but obviously the pressure on them is horrendous. And I think we're really going to start to see some sad sort of shells of things, once glorious things in the arts. Rachel Swaby's just picking up on this conversation, this sort of sub chat that's going on about cash and digital cash and financial inclusion. Rachel, would you be able to come on and talk a little bit about digital cash as a thing? Is Rachel there? Rachel Swaby, are you okay to come on and talk? Maybe we can't find Rachel. That's okay, not to worry. Let's go to Michael Kowalski. Product Michael, is there some tension between local first and social mobility? Your question would suggest to me that you think there is, Michael. Can we hear him?
Okay, I didn't expect you to pull me in here, Liz. Thanks for that.
No worries.
Yeah, I kind of think there is. I mean, as someone who's, you know, I'm an immigrant myself, and you know, kind of think of myself as an Earthling first, and I this kind of, if we focus on local, are we keeping people in their own places? Are we saying that, you know, where you come from, you should work on that little community or something and stay there, frankly, you know, stay up north, working on your things up north, and you know, don't come here. Isn't there some tension?
Yeah, I guess, yeah, it's interesting, because I guess that when we talk about local, we perhaps are tend to be a little misty-eyed about it, but I guess the sort of drain of money and talent and everything else into London has been a source of much ire for tons of people who just don't happen to live in London for a long time, in this country in particular. But I take your point that if you design everything to encourage people to stay put, then maybe there's a tension there. I don't know. I'm not sure. I might go to Professor Lucy Huberman, who I've spoken to a couple of times, or other editors have spoken to in Thinkings before. Also, hi Lucy. Let's unmute Lucy so we can hear what she's saying. Hi Lucy. Oh, we can't hear you. Try again.
I'll try.
Oh yes, there we go. We can hear you now.
How about that?
Yes, perfect.
I'm not sure what you want me to comment on. I've been chatting away.
Yes, you've been chatting away. We're jumping around a little bit, but what about the Arts Council?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I know it is a really dire picture in the UK. I'm on the board of Cecil Sharp House, which is the English Folk and Dance Society. So I've been following a sort of a senior management team. It's a venue, so it's closed, so you can't get, you know, it's like. They've done a great job. The education officer's done a great job moving practically everything online. They've been, you know, applying for additional funds from charities. The Arts Council have had some emergency funding. I don't quite know how that's going or how much.
Yeah.
I think it's to help people get through till September. And those are people with existing Arts Council funding status at certain levels. But I don't know. I do feel upset about the arts, especially museums. I think they've got a really, really terrible time because they completely depend on people coming in the door. They're not used to getting people to pay very much for exhibitions. But small groups I know have been extremely inventive as well. I don't really want to go into lots of names, but either groups, I mean, they're all groups I know quite well. So I don't want to say there isn't a problem, but as you've said, the creative arts and people in the creative arts are extremely inventive and innovative. I think the commercial sector, I don't know if your friend, whoever's had a friend who was closing their whole theatres in the commercial sector or in the funded sector, but I think the commercial sector has been hit very hard. Actually, like universities who've raised a lot of commercial funding, they've been hit harder than small universities that we don't think of necessarily as being such great universities. That's quite interesting. So where you've got the commercial funding dependent on tickets and footfall, they've been hit hardest, but many of those commercial theatres are owned by groups, some of which have deep pockets. So I think it's a very mixed picture. I also know sort of students or people who, you know, have completed degrees and are doing jobs, you know, it's not great making films from their bedroom and posting them. I'm a bit old for Instagram, but there is some amazing stuff going on with young musicians posting, you know, who their influences are and what they like doing. So I think the arts will be quite resilient. Institutions, big institutions like the British Library will be fine. You know, they've got library services that they've made more accessible, and it's forced a lot of people to be more digital before they were ready. I'm going to post on the chat, but there was a sort of a little meme going around at the beginning of lockdown, which listed, you know, 4 things that maybe have advanced your digital strategy for going digital. And they may be, you know, good leadership, vision, funding, or COVID-19 ticked. It's forced a lot of people to become more digital quite quickly. Yeah. And I think that has increased accessibility in many ways as well. So it sort of swings and roundabouts. Yeah. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for the arts. I can't say anything more.
Yeah, I think we all are. Thanks ever so much, Lucy. I'm going to, just because of what Lucy was talking about while we're with the arts, I am going to come to Daniel Dipper, who wants to talk about youth unemployment as well. I can see that David's iPhone, I don't know your surname, David, you've got your digital hand up, but if I could come to Robert Guthrie, you've posted a couple of times in the chat. You are a musician. Are you there, Robert?
Hey there.
Hiya, how you doing? Oh, I recognise you, Robert.
Oh, how?
I think I must have seen you on a Thinking before.
Oh, right, yeah, it's possible. Yeah, so, can you see my video?
Yeah, we can see you. I can see you.
Yeah, basically, well, I'm a freelance musician. First point is I know some very skilled professionals who are now working in Tesco in some of the best classical music institutions, and it's a terrible time for them. And also I'm a freelance musician, and it looks bleak. I'm 22, so I don't really know how it's gonna pan out for us. I don't know, it's all well and good producing online content as we are at the moment, but it's very difficult to get a return on that content, because I feel the nature of how music works at the moment on Spotify and everything like that, it just becomes another clip or something, and I'm not sure how you make that sustainable.
Yeah.
So I hope this doesn't feel like a bit of a rant, but I guess also I make a lot of my money in churches and cathedrals as a classical musician, and those institutions are really under threat, especially the English choral tradition, for example, which is a real treasure, which, you know, I haven't been in a rehearsal for about 3 months now, so it's a bit of a, yeah.
So the churches are opening up again now, I guess, as buildings, aren't they? Will it take just a bit more time for the sort of bells and whistles, if you like, round the edge to crank up as well?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. We also don't really know about the medical impact of choral singing at the moment, or indeed wind instruments. There's been some research. I think the Vienna Philharmonic, they produced a piece of research. It was in German though, so I couldn't consult it. I don't know. It's all up in the air. I know I'm currently based in Scotland, and we can't, you know, churches aren't open yet. I'm meant to be starting a position in Hereford Cathedral in the next few months. I'm not really sure whether that's going to be going ahead. Purely.
I hope it is. Weirdly, I know Hereford Cathedral quite well. So my ex-husband's family are very involved in Hereford Cathedral. It's very beautiful. So I do hope you get to go there. It's a really amazing place.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Robert, and all our very best to you and your chums, doing their best to keep the wool from the door, slung in their guts at Tesco. I hope I hope that all pans out. Let's go to David's iPhone, man of mystery, David's iPhone. I don't know what you're going to talk about, David, but you've had your hand up for a while. Hiya. If we can unmute David so we can hear him. There you go.
Am I?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can see you.
Oh, so,
hiya.
I've been listening to the conversation and the many points that have been made, and it's very, very interesting what's been said. I live down in Cornwall, in central Cornwall, and I've noticed that a couple of things that may back up some of the things you've said. For instance, via the internet, we've got local groups being set up, neighbourhood. You've probably seen it yourselves locally because it's a national thing. And that has definitely generated a lot of conversations about what's happening in our local town. And that has really been a very positive thing. Also, using local services, local shops, local butchers, that's definitely been encouraged because of not being able to get stuff from the supermarket. When the coronavirus first started, if you wanted to go and buy bread flour, you didn't go to the supermarket, you actually went to a local shop, or perhaps a shop that, a restaurant that was providing flour because they had the flour in stock, whereas you couldn't get it in the supermarkets. The other thing is that the digital revolution, which has been promised since the mid-80s, more or less, I think has been forced upon people. And it's definitely got to be a force for good, because these things are definitely going to help people in the future communicate. The other thing is, you talk about recessions and depressions. Unfortunately, I go back away in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and now in the 2020s. These things happen. We go into these things. It seems like the end of the world, more so this time perhaps because of the COVID virus, but we've always been able to reinvent ourselves. We were talking about the Theatre Royal down in Plymouth, and that's been reinventing itself several times. So it's very sad news to hear that they are making people redundant and such, but all being well, they will come back. And these things will definitely sort of coerce themselves back again. Talented people will rise. People like musicians and actors and such will come back. But it's not going to be tomorrow, perhaps, but it will be in time.
Thanks, David. And I agree, and I very much hope you're right, I guess. And actually, one of the things that Mervyn King was talking about when he was on a Thinking, was it the end of last week? I don't know, the days are all the same, was talking about the precise timing and nature of the end of the furlough scheme, which I know doesn't help everybody, but is there for some people inside the arts and culture, particularly in hospitality, and trying to look at softer and more targeted ways to help bridge the gap, because the bounce back, or indeed, as the chat is going on, the sort of the figuring out of the business model, there are plenty of people who are willing and able to create and produce interesting cultural content, for example, that is accessible to huge audiences online. But I guess it's tough to know how to monetize that. That stuff takes a bit more time. So I think it's about the gap between where we are now and the time when all of those things have come and washed through, and how we help those people so they don't fall into a hole that is incredibly difficult to then sort of claw their way out of. I can see that Hackaway has got your hand up. I'm going to come back to Daniel, if I can. Daniel Dipper, who's had his hand up earlier on and posted a piece, and you want to pick up on this youth unemployment piece as well, don't you, Daniel? Are you there?
Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I'm quite kind of concerned about all of this, particularly because I'm 17 years old, nearly 18. I was in year 13, so I'm kind of right in the middle of all of this. I'm hoping to go to university at the end of the year, but I shared a piece that I actually wrote yesterday, just further up on the chat, which is about my concerns regarding the emergency examinations process. And actually, I do think there's quite a strong link about that and what could happen in the future. because to go into the detail of it very briefly, the standardization model actually takes into account your school's past performance, actually in some cases more than your own performance, which to me is quite concerning. And actually it will hit the disadvantaged kind of high learning potential students the hardest, like myself. And I'm quite concerned about that. And I think that it could have an impact on the future, because whilst they are offering an autumn exam series, in my article, I kind of explain the reasons why actually that isn't going to do anything to solve these problems at all. So actually we have a serious risk that thousands of young people, possibly myself, I hope not, but I could be at risk, could be getting grades that are below what they could achieve, and they have no way of dealing with that. So they'll then end up going to some universities which aren't as quite well known, I don't have quite as good careers department, and then actually that will impact them throughout their entire lives from something that they can't control themselves. So I mean, in terms of youth unemployment, I mean, I was a self-employed DJ, so I've been hit there as well. But yeah, I'm particularly concerned about this system because I think it could kind of stilt social mobility, and I think that it could have kind of long-term consequences on actually our society, hopefully becoming much more about actually what you achieve and what you can offer rather than where you're from and how much money you have.
Yes, thanks, Daniel. I totally agree, and I guess obviously all the care in the world is going into trying to make sure that it's fair and to balance off all of those things. But you're right. The concern still remains that if it's not you in the exam room with your pen and paper doing your best, if there are other variables, then who's to say? What is the recourse for when you get your results? It's A-levels you're talking about that you were due to do. Yeah. Yep. So when you get your results, which will be, do you know when in time? Will it be in normal in August?
13th. It'll be the normal results day.
So when you get your results and you look at them and you go, I don't like these results, this is not what I think I would have got. Do you have any sense of what the recourse is to challenge what the decision is?
So you can't appeal it. That is one thing. There's no direct appeal mechanism to it. So the only option you have left is the autumn exam series that the government have offered. Now, exam boards don't have to offer that at all because of the expense. Ofqual have made it very clear that it is an option if they choose to offer it at all. And my concerns about that is the fact that chances are it will be the student themselves who are charged to resit as such. So they'd have to sit these papers, and that could add up to nearly £1,000 for some people. And the very people who are most likely to be hit by this are disadvantaged people. So they're very unlikely to be able to afford that. And then there's some issues about space, because the government have said that they want all students to be in schools by September, every student, and the teaching unions have raised the point that is, if they're trying to offer this autumn exam series as well, that's going to be very, very tricky. And actually some teaching unions have said about boycotting these autumn exams. But I think most importantly, to kind of wrap this up very briefly, is that actually the disadvantaged students like myself, I've had basically no contact time with my teachers at all since schools closed in the middle of March. I had an 8th left of one of my A-levels still to do. And I've kind of been told, there's a textbook, get on with it. I wasn't even allowed to contact my teachers for a month. We've had no lessons, nothing. So us trying to then sit these exams in October, November, there's no point, because we've not had any tuition time. We may even be further back than we were in March because we've not had that support at all. So it is very much a dead end, which is why the government have improved clearing so much this year, but that is no consolation.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Daniel. And really, it must be super worrying. So we're wishing you all the very best. I do hope that on August the 13th, you come on and think and tell us you've got straight A's and it's all sorted itself out. So we really are thinking of you. I'm going to go. We've only got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to go to Hakaway Kasato, you've had your hand up for a while, and you were driving. Hi, nice to see you.
Good afternoon from Mumbai, India. So I've been locked down about 95 days, but I've actually had experience with the Asian financial crisis,
right?
Which was very, very tough, and I actually lost the business. And I'm an entrepreneur, but you know, things are going to come back at the end of the day. It's not going to. It's one of the other gentlemen saying it's not immediately, but things do come back, and I think there's a lot of scope for innovation, as well as thinking outside the box. And I think we have many more tools now compared to when it was back in the 1990s, late 90s, when the Asian financial crisis hit. You know, we're obviously, I'm here in India, you're in London or Oxford for that matter. So I think there's a lot of scope for opportunities. Obviously, the hard facts are there of people losing jobs, etc. I've lost businesses, lost jobs, etc. But I think there's a lot of scope for positivity as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that's a nice sort of spot at which to land, I guess, because there is a lot to be gloomy about. I think what we try to do in these Tuesday meetings is to shake the tree a little bit and see if some stories emerge, or if we can kind of refine our thinking around subjects and topics. And I've made a few notes as we've gone along. It certainly seems to me that we're circling this thing about local and community, small scale economy recovery stuff. It definitely feels to me like there's some thinking that we could do around the dynamic between what will be local authority funded and how that's all going to pan out, to the points that were raised by Paul and John about Section 114, but also about specifically the arts funding. It's almost like the question of what do we consider an essential service. If you think about essential services in local authorities, people automatically think bins, but of course it's a lot more than that. So it feels to me that we're circling an investigation in that space, and it does very much link to this thing about youth unemployment, about young people being disproportionately affected because they're in the sectors that close down first and the hardest. And it relates to Robert's story about being a creative, gig economy dependent person in a creative environment. And it feels to me that although at the moment where we're getting to is sort of admiring the problem, and I feel that quite soon we're going to get into a place of reporting out either the dawn of the problem or the challenges and ways to unravel it, and finding potentially some good and alternative news stories to tell about that. And I've made a third note here, which I think we do need to come back to, which is kind of a watching brief on Generation Z. The TikTok thing with the Trump rally is completely fascinating to me. And I confess I did laugh when I read it. That says perhaps more about how I feel about Trump than anything else. However, TikTok as a platform is completely fascinating and kind of horrible. It sort of feels like the Wild West of the internet. You only have to look at two funny, cat videos or people doing a funny dance to come across some really horrible content on TikTok. So that's the thing that I'm interested in. But also the way that Generation Z are characterized in the media and as this kind of potential disaster for them dawns, and how they respond to that creatively and politically, and maybe it won't be this year, but maybe it will be in 3 or 5 years' time. I think that's a really, really interesting watching brief for us about storytelling, but also about characters and voices and new sort of modes of power expressed both digitally and physically. I think it's fascinating and is yet to play out. It sort of feels like it's coming, bubbling up. But at 13:59, I'm sorry it was me and not James, but thank you very much to Merope. Thank to everybody who has contributed on screen and in the chat. We've got a lot of work to do, and we will continue to do it. If you're available on Thursday, please come to the Education Summit. It's an amazing lineup, starts at 8:15 with Baroness Amos, and we wrap up in the afternoon with the amazing George the Poet, which I'm beside myself with excitement about. And we've got a thinking this evening with Sir Ronald Cohen on impact investment, and tomorrow we're doing royal money. So lots of big meaty conversations. I hope to see you again. Have a lovely afternoon. Thank you very much. Goodbye.